The morning mist hung low over Crystal Lake as Detective Sarah Martinez pulled her patrol car onto the gravel road that wound around the water's edge. It was October 15th, 2019, and the autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and something else, something that made her stomach turn. She had received a call at 6:47 a.m. from a jogger who claimed to have seen something floating near the old fishing dock. Sarah stepped out of her vehicle, her breath visible in the cold air. The lake stretched before her like a mirror, reflecting the gray sky above. She had grown up in the small town of Millbrook, population 8,400, and knew every inch of this lake. As a child, she had spent countless summers swimming in these very waters with her friends. Now, 20 years later, she was walking toward what might be one of the worst crime scenes of her career. The jogger, a middle-aged man named Tom Peterson, stood nervously by the water's edge. His running clothes were soaked with sweat despite the cool temperature, and his hands shook as he pointed toward the dock. "I saw her about 20 minutes ago," he stammered. "At first, I thought it was just some debris, maybe an old tarp or something. But then I got closer and—" His voice trailed off. Sarah followed his gaze and felt her heart sink. Partially submerged near the wooden dock was what appeared to be a human body, face down in the dark water. The victim's long brown hair floated around her head like seaweed, and her arms were bound behind her back with what looked like rope. Even from a distance, Sarah could see that this was no accident. "Did you touch anything?" Sarah asked, already reaching for her radio to call for backup and the coroner. Tom shook his head vigorously. "No, ma'am. As soon as I realized what it was, I called 911 and waited for you to arrive." Within 30 minutes, the quiet lakeside had transformed into a bustling crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off the area, and investigators from the county's major crimes unit had arrived to assist. The victim was carefully extracted from the water by the dive team, revealing the full extent of the horror. The young woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with delicate features and what had once been a beautiful face. Her wrists and ankles were bound with marine rope, and a heavy chain was wrapped around her waist, clearly intended to keep her body submerged. She wore a simple white dress that was now stained with lake water and mud. Dr. Emily Chun, the county medical examiner, knelt beside the body with professional detachment. "Preliminary examination suggests she's been in the water for several months," she told Sarah. "The cold temperature and depth have preserved the body better than we might expect. I'll need to get her back to the lab for a full autopsy, but I can already see signs of blunt force trauma to the head." As Dr. Chun continued her initial examination, Detective Martinez began documenting the scene. She photographed every angle, every piece of evidence, and every detail that might prove important later. The rope used to bind the victim was professional marine grade, the kind used by experienced boaters. The chain was heavy-duty steel, probably from a hardware store or marine supply shop. "Whoever did this wanted to make sure she stayed down," observed Detective Mike Rodriguez, Sarah's partner who had just arrived from another case. "This wasn't a crime of passion. This was planned." The investigation team began canvassing the immediate area for any additional evidence. They found tire tracks in the soft earth near the boat launch, about 50 yards from where the body was discovered. The tracks appeared to be from a large truck or SUV, and they were pressed deep into the ground, suggesting the vehicle had been carrying significant weight. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, burning off the morning mist, Sarah stood at the water's edge and tried to piece together what had happened. Someone had brought this young woman to the lake, probably at night, to avoid detection. They had weighted her down and thrown her into the deep water near the dock, expecting that she would never be found. But the killer had made a mistake. They hadn't accounted for the unusual drought that had lowered the lake's water level by nearly 4 feet over the summer. Detective Martinez, Officer Jenny Walsh approached with an evidence bag in her hand. "We found this caught on one of the dock pilings, about 3 feet underwater." She held up a small gold chain with what appeared to be a military dog tag attached. Sarah's pulse quickened as she examined the chain through the plastic evidence bag. The dog tag was tarnished but still readable. It bore the name Jackson Marcus R., along with a service number and blood type. This was a significant development. Military personnel kept detailed records, and if this tag belonged to either the victim or her killer, it would provide a crucial lead in the investigation. "Bag it and tag it," Sarah instructed. "And give me everything you can on Marcus R. Jackson. Start with the Department of Defense database." The recovery operation continued for several more hours. Divers searched the lake bottom for any additional evidence, while crime scene technicians processed every inch of the shoreline. By late afternoon, they had collected samples of the rope and chain, plaster casts of the tire tracks, the mysterious dog tag, and numerous photographs of the scene. As the body was loaded into the coroner's van, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this case was going to be more complicated than it initially appeared. The professional nature of the binding, the military connection suggested by the dog tag, and the remote location all pointed to someone with specific skills and knowledge. Dr. Chen approached Sarah as she was finishing her preliminary report. "I should have initial autopsy results by tomorrow morning," she said. "But I can tell you this much," she fought. "There are defensive wounds on her hands and arms and what appears to be skin under her fingernails. Whoever did this to her didn't have an easy time of it." That evening, Sarah returned to the police station and began the process of trying to identify the victim. She ran the woman's fingerprints through the national database, but came up empty. She then started going through missing persons reports from the past year, looking for anyone matching the victim's description. The process was tedious and heartbreaking. Case after case of young women who had vanished without a trace, leaving behind desperate families and unanswered questions. But none of them seemed to match their victim exactly. The woman from the lake appeared to be of mixed ethnicity, possibly Hispanic and Asian, with distinctive features that should have made her easy to identify. As midnight approached, Sarah finally found what she was looking for. A missing person report filed 6 months earlier by a woman named Carmen Delgado in the nearby city of Riverside. The report was for her daughter, Isabella Delgado Chun, age 23, who had failed to return home from her job as a translator for a private military contracting company. The photograph attached to the missing person report showed a young woman with the same delicate features and long brown hair as their victim. Isabella had been working as a freelance translator, specializing in Arabic and Farsi, and had been employed by various government agencies and private contractors. According to her mother, Isabella had been excited about a new assignment that would pay exceptionally well, but she had been secretive about the details. Sarah immediately called Carmen Delgado, despite the late hour. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of her career. Carmen had never given up hope that her daughter was alive somewhere, perhaps just unable to contact home. Learning that Isabella's body had been found in Crystal Lake, obviously murdered, shattered that hope forever. "She was such a good girl," Carmen sobbed over the phone. "She worked so hard to build her career, to make something of herself. Who would want to hurt her? She never bothered anyone." According to Carmen, Isabella had been dating someone in the military, though she had been vague about his identity and their relationship. "She said he was Special Forces or something like that," Carmen recalled. "She was always careful about operational security, never talked about his work, or gave me his real name. She just called him M when she mentioned him." The letter M matched the initial on the dog tag found at the scene. Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to come together, but she knew she was still missing crucial information. Why had Isabella been killed? What kind of work had she been doing that put her in danger? And who was this mysterious military boyfriend? As Sarah finally headed home in the early morning hours, she knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and revelations. The investigation into Isabella Delgado Chin's murder was just beginning, and something told her that the truth would be far more complex and dangerous than anything she had encountered before in her small-town police career. The quiet streets of Millbrook seemed almost surreal after the intensity of the crime scene. As she drove through the sleeping town, Sarah couldn't help but think about Isabella, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, whose dreams and ambitions had been cut short by someone's violence. Finding her killer wouldn't bring Isabella back, but it would give her family the justice they deserved and ensure that whoever was responsible could never hurt anyone else. The investigation had revealed the first threads of a mystery that would soon prove to involve military contractors, classified government work, and secrets that powerful people would kill to protect. But for now, Sarah focused on the immediate task ahead, identifying the owner of the dog tag and learning everything she could about Isabella's final days. The case of the woman in the lake was about to become the most important investigation of Detective Sarah Martinez's career, one that would test not only her skills as an investigator, but also her courage in the face of forces much larger and more dangerous than anything Millbrook had ever seen before. The next morning brought Dr. Chen's preliminary autopsy results, and they painted an even darker picture than Sarah had anticipated. Isabella Delgado Chen had suffered multiple blunt force injuries to her head and torso, consistent with being beaten with a heavy object. The cause of death was drowning, meaning she had been alive when she entered the water. The injuries suggest a prolonged assault, Dr. Chen explained as she walked Sarah through the findings in the sterile examination room. Someone worked her over pretty thoroughly before dumping her in the lake. The defensive wounds indicate she fought back hard. I've sent the skin samples from under her fingernails for DNA analysis, but that could take several weeks. More disturbing were the signs that Isabella had been held captive for an extended period before her death. Ligature marks on her wrists and ankles showed evidence of prolonged restraint, and evidence of dehydration and malnutrition suggested she had been imprisoned for days or possibly weeks. Meanwhile, Sarah's research into Marcus R. Jackson had yielded concerning results. According to military records, Petty Officer First Class Marcus Jackson was a Navy SEAL assigned to SEAL Team 6, one of the most elite special operations units in the U.S. military. His record showed multiple deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq with commendations for valor and numerous classified operations. However, when Sarah attempted to contact Jackson through official military channels, she hit a wall. His commanding officer, Captain Robert Hayes, was reluctant to discuss Jackson's whereabouts or current assignment status. Petty Officer Jackson is involved in sensitive operations, Hayes explained during a terse phone conversation. I'm afraid I can't provide any information about his activities or location without proper authorization from higher up the chain of command. This response only heightened Sarah's suspicions. In her experience, military personnel were generally cooperative with legitimate police investigations, especially those involving potential crimes by service members. The evasive response suggested that either Jackson was involved in something highly classified or that the military already knew about potential problems with the SEAL. Detective Rodriguez had been working the financial angle, tracing Isabella's bank records and employment history. What he discovered was troubling. In the 6 months before her disappearance, Isabella had deposited unusually large sums of money into her account, payments that far exceeded what a freelance translator would typically earn. "Look at this," Mike said, spreading out bank statements across Sarah's desk. 3 deposits of $25,000 each over a 4-month period. That's more money than most people in this town make in a year. Whatever she was translating, it was worth a lot to someone. The payments had all come from a company called Blackwater Solutions, a private military contracting firm based in Virginia. Sarah had heard of similar companies. They provided security services, training, and other military-related services to government agencies and private clients. The work often involved classified contracts and operations in dangerous parts of the world. Sarah decided to contact Blackwater Solutions directly, hoping to learn more about Isabella's work with them. The conversation with their corporate security officer, a man named David Sterling, was professionally polite but ultimately uninformative. Ms. Delgado Chen was indeed one of our contract translators, Sterling confirmed. She specialized in Middle Eastern languages and had the appropriate security clearances for sensitive work. However, I'm not at liberty to discuss the specific nature of her assignments without a court order. When Sarah pressed for more information about Isabella's last assignment, Sterling's tone became noticeably cooler. "I think it would be best if you directed any further inquiries through our legal department," he said before ending the call. The pattern was becoming clear. Everywhere Sarah turned in this investigation, she encountered walls of secrecy and official reluctance to cooperate. This wasn't typical of a simple murder case, even one involving military personnel. Something much bigger was happening here. Later that afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at the police station. A tall, impeccably dressed woman in her 40s approached the front desk and asked to speak with the detective handling the Crystal Lake case. She introduced herself as Rebecca Manning, an attorney from Washington, D.C. "I represent certain interests that may be relevant to your investigation," Manning explained as she sat across from Sarah in the interview room. She spoke with the precise diction of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. "My clients are concerned that this case may inadvertently expose sensitive national security information." Sarah felt her temper rising. "Ms. Manning, a young woman was tortured and murdered. My job is to find her killer, not to protect anyone's secrets." Manning nodded sympathetically, but her expression remained businesslike. "Of course, and no one wants to interfere with the pursuit of justice. However, there are ways to conduct this investigation that would be less problematic for ongoing operations. I'm here to offer assistance and ensure that everyone's interests are protected." "What exactly are you suggesting?" Sarah asked. "Simply that you coordinate with the appropriate federal agencies before proceeding with certain aspects of your investigation. There are national security implications that a local police department might not be equipped to handle." Sarah had encountered federal interference in local cases before, usually involving drug trafficking or terrorism-related matters. But this felt different. The woman across from her wasn't a government official. She was a private attorney representing unnamed clients who seemed very concerned about what Sarah might discover. After Manning left, Sarah called her superior, Chief of Police Frank Morrison. Morrison was a 30-year veteran of law enforcement who had seen his share of complicated cases. When Sarah explained the situation, his response was immediate and clear. "This is our jurisdiction, and Isabella Delgado-Chin was murdered in our town," he said firmly. "I don't care how many lawyers or federal agencies get involved. We're going to investigate this case properly and find out who killed that girl." Morrison's support gave Sarah the confidence to continue pursuing the leads aggressively. She decided to take a different approach and reached out directly to Isabella's mother, Carmen, hoping to learn more about her daughter's personal life and relationships. Carmen agreed to meet Sarah at her home in Riverside, a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood. The walls were covered with photographs of Isabella, graduation pictures, family gatherings, and images from her travels. It was clear that Isabella had been the center of her mother's world. She was so excited about her career, Carmen explained as she served Sarah coffee in the small kitchen. After college, she struggled to find good work. The translation jobs were mostly part-time and didn't pay well. But then she got her security clearance, and everything changed. She was making real money for the first time in her life. Carmen showed Sarah some of Isabella's personal belongings that had been returned to her after the missing person investigation was opened. Among them was a smartphone that the police had been unable to unlock due to its advanced encryption. "She always used the most secure phones," Carmen noted. She said her work required it. "Even when she called me, she was careful about what she said on the phone." Sarah examined the phone, noting that it was a model typically used by government agencies and military personnel, far more sophisticated than what a typical civilian would need. This suggested that Isabella's work involved genuinely sensitive information, not just routine translation services. During their conversation, Carmen mentioned something that made Sarah's pulse quicken. About 3 months before she disappeared, Isabella seemed scared. "She called me one night, very late, and said she might need to disappear for a while. She wouldn't tell me why, but she made me promise that if anything happened to her, I should tell the police to look into her work with the government contractors." "Did she mention any specific threats or problems?" Sarah asked. Carmen shook her head sadly. She just said that she had learned something she wasn't supposed to know, and that some people were very unhappy about it. The last time I talked to her, she said she was thinking about quitting her job and maybe leaving the country for a while. This conversation convinced Sarah that Isabella's murder was directly connected to her work as a translator. She had somehow stumbled upon information that someone was willing to kill to protect. The challenge now was figuring out exactly what that information was and who was responsible for silencing her. Back at the police station, Sarah began researching Blackwater Solutions more thoroughly. What she discovered was a company with extensive contracts throughout the Middle East, providing security and logistic support for U.S. military operations. They had been involved in several controversial incidents over the years, including allegations of civilian casualties and financial improprieties. More interesting was the company's connection to Marcus Jackson. Cross-referencing military databases with corporate records, Sarah found evidence that Jackson had worked as a contractor for Blackwater Solutions during periods when he was on leave from active SEAL duty. This provided a direct link between the dog tag found at the crime scene and Isabella's employer. Late that evening, as Sarah was preparing to leave the station, she received a phone call that would change the entire direction of the investigation. The caller identified himself as Sergeant First Class Tony Reeves, a member of Marcus Jackson's SEAL team. "Detective, I heard about the investigation into Marcus Jackson," Reeves said, his voice tense with concern. "I think there are some things you need to know about what really happened to that translator. But I can't talk about it over the phone, and I can't come to your police station. If you want the truth about this case, you need to meet me tonight." Reeves gave Sarah an address for a truck stop about 30 miles outside of town, insisting that she come alone and tell no one about the meeting. Every instinct Sarah had developed as a police officer told her that this was dangerous and potentially foolish. But the case had reached a dead end through official channels, and Reeves might be her only chance to learn what really happened to Isabella. As she drove through the dark countryside toward the truck stop, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to uncover something much larger and more dangerous than a simple murder case. The layers of secrecy, the federal interference, and the military connections all pointed to a conspiracy that reached far beyond the borders of her small town. The truth about Isabella Delgado-Chin's death was waiting somewhere in the shadows ahead, but Sarah was beginning to understand that finding it might put her own life in danger. The truck stop sat like an island of harsh fluorescent light in the darkness of the rural highway. Sarah pulled her unmarked police car into a parking spot away from the main building, her hand instinctively checking her service weapon as she scanned the area for potential threats. The meeting could be a trap, but her gut told her that Sergeant Reeves was genuinely trying to help. She found him sitting in a corner booth of the nearly empty diner, nursing a cup of black coffee. Tony Reeves was exactly what Sarah had expected a Navy SEAL to look like, compact but powerfully built, with the kind of alertness that suggested he was constantly aware of his surroundings. His civilian clothes couldn't hide the military bearing, and when he stood to shake her hand, she noticed the controlled way he moved. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly as they settled into the booth. "I know this seems cloak and dagger, but there are people who would rather this conversation never happened." Reeves looked around the diner cautiously before beginning his story. "Marcus Jackson was my teammate for 3 years. Good operator, reliable in the field, but he had a problem with authority and a bigger problem with money. About 18 months ago, he started taking on side work with private contractors during his leave time. Nothing unusual about that. Lots of guys do it to supplement their military pay." Sarah pulled out her notebook, but Reeves shook his head. "No notes. This conversation never happened. Understand? If word gets back to the wrong people that I talked to you, I'll be the next body they fish out of the lake." The seriousness in his voice convinced Sarah to put away her notebook and listen carefully. "Marcus got involved with some bad people," Reeves continued. "At first, it was just regular security work for Blackwater Solutions. But then he started bragging about making serious money, more than any legitimate contractor work would pay. When we pressed him about it, he said he was doing special projects that required his particular skills." According to Reeves, Jackson had become involved in what could only be described as assassination work, eliminating targets that the U.S. government wanted dead but couldn't officially touch. The operations were funded through private contractors but directed by a shadowy network of military and intelligence officials who operated outside normal channels. Isabella Delgado Chen was translating communications for these operations, Reeves explained. She was good at her job, maybe too good. She started piecing together information from multiple assignments and figured out what was really happening. The people running this operation couldn't risk her exposing them. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Are you saying she was killed by her own government? Not officially, Reeves said grimly. This isn't government policy. It's a rogue operation run by people who think they know better than elected officials. They use legitimate military assets like Marcus for deniability, but the orders come from a small group of military contractors and intelligence officials who have their own agenda. The sergeant explained that Isabella had tried to report her concerns through proper channels, but her warnings had been ignored or suppressed by the very people involved in the illegal operations. When she threatened to go public with what she knew, the decision was made to eliminate her. Marcus was supposed to make her disappear quietly, Reeves said, his voice heavy with disgust. But something went wrong. Maybe she fought harder than expected, or maybe Marcus's conscience finally got to him. Either way, the job was sloppy, and that's why you found her. Sarah leaned forward intensely. Where's Marcus Jackson now? Reeves's expression darkened. That's the thing. I don't think Marcus killed her. 3 days after Isabella disappeared, Marcus came to me in a panic. He said he had been set up, that someone was trying to frame him for her murder. He was scared, really scared, and that wasn't like Marcus at all. According to Reeves, Jackson had been contacted by his handlers at Blackwater Solutions and told to meet with Isabella Delgado Chen to discuss security concerns about her work. When he arrived at the meeting location, a safe house outside of town, he found Isabella already dead and evidence planted to implicate him in her murder. Marcus knew he was being set up, Reeves explained. He panicked and ran, which only made him look more guilty. But he swore to me that he never touched that girl. Someone else killed her and used Marcus as a convenient scapegoat. This revelation changed everything Sarah thought she knew about the case. If Jackson was innocent, then the real killer was still out there, possibly someone much more dangerous and better connected than a rogue Navy SEAL, who would have the resources and motivation to frame Jackson. Sarah asked. Reeves hesitated for a long moment before answering. The operation Isabella was investigating involved high-ranking officials in both the military and civilian government. If she had exposed them, it would have brought down careers and possibly led to criminal prosecutions. These people had billions of dollars in defense contracts at stake. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small USB drive, sliding it across the table to Sarah. Marcus gave me this before he disappeared. He said it contained copies of Isabella's translation work, the communications that got her killed. I haven't looked at it because I know that just having this information makes me a target. Sarah pocketed the drive carefully. What happened to Marcus? I don't know, Reeves admitted. He was supposed to check in with me every week, but I haven't heard from him in 4 months. Either he's hiding somewhere very deep, or he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. The sergeant stood to leave, but Sarah grabbed his arm. Why are you telling me this? Why risk your career and your life to help a local police investigation? Reeves looked at her with the kind of intensity that came from years of combat experience. Because Isabella Delgado Chen was an innocent woman who tried to do the right thing, and she died for it. Because Marcus Jackson, for all his faults, was my teammate, and he's either dead or running for his life because someone needed a scapegoat. And because if we don't stop these people, they'll keep killing anyone who threatens their operation. After Reeves left, Sarah sat in her car in the truck stop parking lot, trying to process what she had just learned. The case had evolved from a local murder investigation into something that threatened the foundations of her understanding of justice and government accountability. The USB drive in her pocket felt like it weighed a ton. She knew that accessing its contents would cross a line from which there might be no return. But Isabella Delgado Chen deserved justice, and the only way to get it was to expose the truth about what had really happened to her. Sarah drove back to Millbrook in a state of deep concern and determination. She couldn't trust local or federal authorities with this information. For all she knew, some of them might be involved in the conspiracy. She needed to be very careful about who she trusted and how she proceeded. At home, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with her personal laptop, staring at the USB drive. She knew that once she accessed its contents, she would become a target herself. But the alternative, letting Isabella's killers escape justice, was unacceptable. The files on the drive were extensive and deeply disturbing. Isabella had been translating intercepted communications between various terrorist groups and their financial backers. But as she worked on more assignments, she had noticed patterns that suggested some of the communications were being manufactured rather than intercepted. The fake intelligence was being used to justify military operations and drone strikes against targets that posed no real threat to American interests. Instead, the operations were designed to eliminate people who stood in the way of various business interests in the Middle East, oil deals, mining rights, and construction contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Isabella had documented everything meticulously, creating a paper trail that proved the existence of a conspiracy involving military contractors, intelligence officials, and corporate executives. The network operated by creating false intelligence reports that justified eliminating business competitors and political opponents under the guise of counterterrorism operations. Sarah realized that she was looking at evidence of systematic war crimes and possibly treason. The people involved had used the American military as a private army to advance their business interests, resulting in the deaths of countless innocent people overseas. But the most shocking revelation came in Isabella's final translation work. She had discovered that the network was planning to expand their operations domestically, targeting American citizens who posed threats to their interests. Journalists, politicians, and activists who asked inconvenient questions would be eliminated using the same methods that had been perfected overseas. Isabella's murder wasn't just about silencing one translator. It was a test run for a domestic assassination program that would target any American who threatened the network's power and profits. As Sarah read through the files, she understood why Isabella had been so frightened in her final weeks. She had stumbled upon a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and military command. The young translator had tried to do the right thing by reporting her concerns, but she had underestimated the ruthlessness of the people she was trying to expose. Now Sarah faced the same choice that had ultimately cost Isabella her life. She could try to expose the conspiracy and risk everything, or she could bury the evidence and let the killers continue their operations. For Sarah, there was really no choice at all. The next morning, Sarah made copies of all the files and began developing a plan to bring the conspiracy to light. She knew she couldn't trust anyone in law enforcement or government. The network had too many connections and too much influence. Instead, she would have to find journalists and activists who had the resources and courage to publish the truth. But first, she needed to find Marcus Jackson. If he was still alive, his testimony would be crucial to proving that Isabella's murder was part of a larger conspiracy. And if he was dead, she needed to find his body and the evidence that would prove who had really killed him. The investigation into Isabella Delgado-Chin's murder had become a race against time, with Sarah fighting to expose the truth before the people responsible could silence her the way they had silenced Isabella. Sarah's first priority was finding Marcus Jackson, but she knew she couldn't use official law enforcement channels without alerting the conspiracy to her investigation. Instead, she decided to trace Jackson's movements using the skills she had learned during her years as a detective, combined with the resources available to any determined investigator. She started with Jackson's financial records, which she accessed through legitimate police databases. What she found painted a picture of a man who had been preparing to disappear. In the weeks before Isabella's murder, Jackson had liquidated his savings account, sold his car, and terminated his lease on an apartment near the naval base. More tellingly, Jackson had purchased a large amount of survival equipment from various outdoor retailers: camping gear, non-perishable food, water purification tablets, and other supplies that someone might need if they were planning to live off the grid for an extended period. The purchases had been made using cash at stores scattered across 3 different states, suggesting that Jackson was trying to avoid leaving a clear trail. But he had made one mistake that gave Sarah a crucial lead. He had used a credit card to purchase a detailed topographic map of the Appalachian Mountains from an online retailer. Sarah studied the map, looking for areas where someone with military survival training might be able to hide indefinitely. She focused on remote regions with access to fresh water and natural shelter, far from major population centers where Jackson might be recognized. After 2 days of research, Sarah identified several potential locations where Jackson might be hiding. She decided to start with the most promising area, a wilderness region in the mountains of North Carolina, known for its extensive cave systems and limited government presence. Sarah took vacation time from work, not wanting to involve her department in what could be a dangerous operation. She told Chief Morrison that she needed some time to clear her head after the intensity of the lake case, which wasn't entirely untrue. The drive to North Carolina took 8 hours, giving Sarah plenty of time to think about the risks she was taking. If the conspiracy was as extensive as Isabella's file suggested, her investigation had probably already been noticed. The people responsible for Isabella's murder wouldn't hesitate to kill a small-town police detective who was getting too close to the truth. Sarah arrived in the mountain town of Cedar Falls as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the heavily forested landscape. The town had a population of fewer than 2,000 people, and everyone seemed to know everyone else. It was the kind of place where a stranger would be noticed immediately, but where people also minded their own business and respected others' privacy. She checked into a small motel and began asking careful questions around town. Sarah presented herself as a hiker interested in exploring the more remote trails in the area, gradually steering conversations toward whether anyone had noticed unusual activity in the wilderness areas. On her second day in Cedar Falls, Sarah struck pay dirt. The owner of the local outdoor supply store, a grizzled former Marine named Pete Sullivan, mentioned that someone had been purchasing supplies from him over the past few months, always paying cash and always buying the kind of gear that suggested long-term wilderness living. Fella claimed to be writing a book about survival techniques, Sullivan explained as he restocked shelves in his cluttered store. But he had the look of someone who'd seen real combat, knew exactly what he needed, and didn't waste time browsing around like most of the amateur outdoors types. Sullivan described a man who matched Marcus Jackson's physical description: medium height, muscular build, dark hair, and the kind of alertness that suggested military training. More importantly, Sullivan mentioned that the man had asked specific questions about the cave systems in the nearby national forest. Told him about Whitewater Cave, Sullivan said. It's about 15 miles up Forest Service Road 42. Real remote area, and the cave system extends for miles underground. Good place to disappear if that's what someone's looking to do. Sarah thanked Sullivan for the information and spent the rest of the day studying maps of the area and planning her approach to the cave system. She knew she was taking a significant risk by going alone, but she couldn't trust anyone else with information that could get them killed. The next morning, Sarah hiked the Forest Service Road toward Whitewater Cave, carrying a backpack with basic camping gear and emergency supplies. The road was barely more than a dirt track, and she saw no signs of recent vehicle traffic. After about 3 miles of hiking, she left the road and began following deer trails deeper into the wilderness. The cave entrance was larger than she had expected, a gaping hole in a limestone cliff face that could easily hide a person or even a small camp. Sarah approached cautiously, her hand on her weapon, calling out to announce her presence. "Marcus Jackson? My name is Detective Sarah Martinez with the Millbrook Police Department. I'm investigating Isabella Delgado Chin's murder, and I think you might be able to help me find her real killer." For a long moment, there was only silence from the cave. Then, Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on stone, and a voice called out from the darkness. "How do I know you're really a cop? How do I know you're not one of them?" Sarah pulled out her badge and held it where it could be seen from the cave entrance. "Because if I was one of them, you'd already be dead. I'm here because I think you've been set up for a murder you didn't commit." Slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows of the cave. Marcus Jackson looked exactly like his military photographs, but months of living rough had taken their toll. He was thinner than his official pictures, his hair and beard had grown out, and his clothes were dirty and worn. But his eyes were alert and intelligent, and Sarah could see why he had been selected for elite special operations. "What makes you think I didn't kill her?" Jackson asked, keeping his distance, but no longer hiding. Sarah spent the next hour explaining everything she had learned about the investigation. The evidence at the scene, the connections to Blackwater Solutions, her conversation with Tony Reeves, and, most importantly, the contents of Isabella's files. As she talked, she watched Jackson's expressions carefully, looking for any signs of deception. What she saw instead was a man who had been carrying the weight of terrible knowledge for months. When Sarah finished her explanation, Jackson sat down heavily on a fallen log and put his head in his hands. "I should have known they would try to pin it on me," he said finally. "When they told me to meet with Isabella, they said she had security concerns about her work. They said she had been asking too many questions and needed to be briefed on operational security procedures." According to Jackson, he had arrived at the safe house to find Isabella already dead, clearly tortured before being killed. The scene had been arranged to implicate him. His dog tags had been planted, and there were even photographs that appeared to show him at the location. "I knew it was a setup, but I also knew that no one would believe me," Jackson explained. "My own commanding officers were probably involved in the conspiracy. If I had tried to report it through official channels, I would have ended up dead within days." Jackson had panicked and run, taking with him evidence that he hoped would eventually prove his innocence. He had been living in the cave system for months, occasionally venturing out for supplies, but mostly staying hidden and trying to figure out how to expose the people who had framed him. "I've been waiting for the right person to trust with this information," Jackson said, looking at Sarah with something like hope in his eyes. "Someone who wasn't part of the system, someone who might actually care about finding the truth." Jackson led Sarah deeper into the cave system, to a natural chamber where he had established a primitive camp. Hidden among his supplies was a waterproof container filled with documents and photographs that he had collected during his work with the conspiracy. The evidence was devastating. Jackson had photographs of meetings between high-ranking military officers and corporate executives, financial records showing millions of dollars in illegal payments, and communication logs that proved the systematic manufacture of false intelligence reports. Most importantly, Jackson had recorded a conversation with his handler at Blackwater Solutions, a man named Colonel Richard Stone, in which Stone explicitly discussed the plan to eliminate Isabella and frame Jackson for her murder. "Stone is the key to the whole operation," Jackson explained as he showed Sarah the hidden recording device he had used. "He's the one who coordinates between the military and corporate sides of the conspiracy. Take him down, and you can bring down the whole network." Sarah realized that she now had enough evidence to expose the conspiracy, but she also understood that simply turning the information over to law enforcement would be ineffective and dangerous. The network had too many connections in government and military circles to be brought down through conventional channels. "We need to go public with this," Sarah told Jackson. "Find journalists who can't be bought or intimidated, and make sure the story gets out to as many people as possible. Once it's public, they can't just make us disappear." Jackson nodded grimly. "I've been thinking the same thing. But we need to be very careful about who we trust. These people have killed to protect their secret, and they won't hesitate to kill again." Over the next several hours, Sarah and Jackson developed a plan to expose the conspiracy. They would contact multiple journalists simultaneously, providing each with portions of the evidence, and coordinating a simultaneous release of the story across multiple media outlets. But first, they needed to get additional confirmation of Colonel Stone's involvement and gather more recent evidence of the conspiracy's activities. Jackson believed that Stone was still actively directing operations from his position at Blackwater Solutions, and if they could prove ongoing criminal activity, it would make the case much stronger. Sarah realized that she would have to return to her investigation with new purpose and much greater caution. Armed with Jackson's evidence and testimony, she could now prove that Isabella's murder was part of a larger conspiracy. But she also understood that by taking this step, she was putting herself directly in the crosshairs of people who had already proven they were willing to kill to protect their secrets. The next phase of the investigation would be the most dangerous yet, as Sarah worked to gather the final pieces of evidence needed to bring down a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military and corporate power. Isabella Delgadochin's murder had been just the tip of the iceberg, and exposing the truth would require courage that Sarah wasn't entirely sure she possessed. But as she looked at the evidence of Isabella's systematic torture and murder, and thought about all the other innocent people who had died to advance the conspiracy's goals, Sarah knew she had no choice but to see this investigation through to its conclusion, regardless of the personal cost. Sarah returned to Millbrook with a new understanding of the magnitude of what she was facing. The evidence Jackson had provided was compelling, but she knew that exposing the conspiracy would require more than just documents and recordings. She needed to catch the perpetrators in the act of ongoing criminal activity. Her plan was risky, but straightforward. Using Jackson's knowledge of the conspiracy's operations, she would pose as a potential new recruit for their network. With her law enforcement background and access to sensitive information, she could credibly present herself as someone who might be useful to their operation. The first step was establishing contact with Colonel Stone through seemingly legitimate channels. Sarah had Jackson call his former handler, claiming that he had decided to surrender and wanted to negotiate a deal. The call was brief, but Stone took the bait, agreeing to meet with Jackson at a location of Stone's choosing. Sarah wore a wire during the meeting, hidden in what appeared to be a normal police radio. Jackson had coached her on Stone's personality and methods, warning her that the colonel was intelligent and paranoid, but also arrogant enough to believe that he could manipulate anyone he encountered. The meeting took place at a private club in the state capital, the kind of establishment where powerful people conducted business away from public scrutiny. Stone was exactly what Sarah had expected. A career military officer in his late 50s with the bearing of someone accustomed to command and the cold eyes of someone who had made difficult decisions without regret. Detective Martinez, Stone said as they settled into leather chairs in a quiet corner of the club's lounge. Marcus tells me you've been investigating the unfortunate death of Isabella Delgadochin. I understand you've reached some interesting conclusions about that case. Sarah had prepared carefully for this conversation, crafting a persona that would appeal to Stone's worldview. She presented herself as a pragmatic law enforcement officer who was tired of watching criminals escape justice because of legal technicalities and bureaucratic limitations. The system is broken, Colonel, she said, echoing talking points that Jackson had told her Stone frequently used. We spend so much time worrying about the rights of terrorists and criminals that we forget about protecting innocent Americans. Sometimes justice requires people who are willing to work outside the constraints of official channels. Stone's expression remained neutral, but Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes as he evaluated her potential usefulness. Over the course of their conversation, he gradually revealed more about the network's philosophy and methods, always speaking in hypothetical terms but making his meaning clear. Imagine, Detective, if there were a way to ensure that people who threaten American interests could be dealt with efficiently without the endless delays and political complications of the legal system, Stone said. Imagine if dedicated patriots could take decisive action to protect our country from its enemies, both foreign and domestic. As the conversation continued, Sarah realized that Stone was recruiting her. The colonel believed that a small-town police detective with access to local information and investigative resources could be valuable to their operation. More importantly, he seemed convinced that Sarah shared their twisted view of justice and patriotism. By the end of the meeting, Stone had offered Sarah what he called a consulting position with Blackwater Solutions, work that would supplement her police salary while allowing her to serve her country in ways that most people could never understand. Sarah accepted the offer, knowing that it would give her access to the inner workings of the conspiracy. Over the following weeks, she attended meetings and received assignments that gradually revealed the full scope of the network's activities. The conspiracy was even more extensive than Isabella's files had suggested. The network operated domestic surveillance programs that monitored journalists, activists, and politicians who posed threats to their interests. They had corrupted officials in multiple government agencies, ensuring that their operations remained hidden from legitimate oversight. Most disturbing of all, Sarah learned that Isabella's murder had been just one of many. The network had eliminated dozens of people over the years: translators, contractors, whistleblowers, and journalists who had learned too much about their activities. Each death had been carefully arranged to appear accidental or to implicate innocent scapegoats. Sarah documented everything, gathering evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or suppress. She recorded meetings, photographed documents, and collected financial records that proved the network's funding sources and operational methods. But as she gathered more evidence, Sarah realized that some members of the conspiracy were beginning to suspect her true motives. Her questions were becoming too probing, and her background checks were more thorough than those of typical recruits. The crisis came when Colonel Stone assigned Sarah to eliminate a journalist who was investigating defense contractor corruption. The target was Rachel Morrison, an investigative reporter for a major newspaper who had been asking uncomfortable questions about Blackwater Solutions contracts. Ms. Morrison has become a problem that needs to be resolved, Stone explained during a private meeting. She's been promised information by someone claiming to have inside knowledge of our operations. We can't allow her to publish anything that might compromise ongoing missions. Sarah realized that this someone was probably Marcus Jackson, and that the network had somehow discovered his location despite his efforts to remain hidden. She had to act quickly to protect both Jackson and the journalist, while also preserving the evidence she had gathered. Working with Jackson, who had remained in hiding but maintained communication through encrypted channels, Sarah developed a plan to expose the entire network simultaneously. They would coordinate the release of all their evidence to multiple news outlets, law enforcement agencies, and congressional oversight committees at the same time, making it impossible for the conspiracy to suppress the information. But first, they had to ensure the safety of Rachel Morrison and anyone else who might be targeted for elimination. Sarah used her position within the network to learn about other planned operations, discovering a hit list that included not only Morrison, but also 3 other journalists, 2 congressional staffers, and a military prosecutor who had been investigating defense contractor fraud. On the night before the planned exposure, Sarah attended what was supposed to be her final meeting with the network's leadership. Stone and several other key figures had gathered to finalize plans for the elimination of their targets and to welcome Sarah as a full member of their organization. Sarah wore recording equipment that captured every word of their discussion, including explicit admissions of murder, conspiracy, and treason. The network's leaders spoke openly about their past crimes and their plans for future operations, confident that they were among trusted allies. When Stone handed Sarah a detailed dossier on Rachel Morrison, including her home address and daily routine, Sarah knew she had all the evidence she needed. But she also realized that she was now in immediate danger. If the network suspected her true loyalties, they would kill her without hesitation. The meeting ended with Sarah being given 48 hours to complete the assassination of Rachel Morrison. As she left the building, she knew that she had to move quickly to prevent the murder while also ensuring that her evidence reached the public before the network could silence her. Working through the night, Sarah and Jackson coordinated with a network of investigative journalists, congressional investigators, and federal prosecutors who were not compromised by the conspiracy. At exactly 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, the story broke simultaneously across every major news outlet in the country. The headlines were devastating. Military contractors operated domestic assassination network. Rogue officers murdered translator to hide war crimes. Pentagon infiltrated by corporate death squad. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Sarah's recordings, Jackson's documentation, and Isabella's translation files painted a complete picture of systematic criminal activity that reached into the highest levels of military and corporate leadership. Within hours of the story's publication, Colonel Stone and a dozen other key figures in the conspiracy were arrested by federal agents who had not been corrupted by the network. The arrests were coordinated to prevent the destruction of evidence or the elimination of witnesses. Marcus Jackson emerged from hiding to testify before Congress about his experiences and to clear his name of any involvement in Isabella's murder. His testimony, combined with Sarah's evidence, led to the largest military corruption investigation in American history. In the end, more than 40 people were convicted of crimes ranging from murder and conspiracy to treason and fraud. The network's corporate allies lost billions of dollars in defense contracts, and new oversight procedures were implemented to prevent similar conspiracies in the future. Isabella Delgado Chin was posthumously honored for her courage in trying to expose the conspiracy, with a memorial established in her name to support whistleblowers and transparency advocates. Her mother, Carmen, finally had the answers she needed about her daughter's death and the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served. Sarah returned to her duties as a detective in Millbrook, but her experience with the conspiracy had changed her forever. She had learned that the greatest threats to justice sometimes came from within the very institutions supposed to protect it, and that ordinary people sometimes had to take extraordinary risks to preserve democracy and the rule of law. The case of the woman in the lake had started as a simple murder investigation, but it had ultimately exposed a cancer at the heart of American military and corporate culture. Isabella Delgado Chin's death had not been in vain. Her sacrifice had helped bring down a network of killers and conspirators who believed they were above the law. Years later, when Sarah reflected on the investigation that had defined her career, she always remembered Isabella as a young woman who had died trying to do the right thing. The translator's courage in the face of overwhelming danger had inspired others to step forward and fight for justice, proving that even in the darkest circumstances, truth and righteousness could ultimately prevail. The conspiracy had been defeated, but Sarah knew that the price of freedom was eternal vigilance. There would always be people who sought to abuse their power and silence those who threatened their interests. The memory of Isabella Delgado Chin would serve as a reminder that ordinary citizens had both the responsibility and the power to hold their leaders accountable, no matter how dangerous that effort might be.